Today, we're gonna be figuring out the hardest Pokemon to capture in each region. But before we begin, I first have to state for this video, we will not be including any mythicals or real-time based events, as most of them have already come and gone, and there won't likely ever be another opportunity to get them again. Also, if any commonly found Pokemon can evolve into rarely found Pokemon, then they will also not be included here. For example, in X and Y, Abomasnow only has a 1% encounter rate on Route 17, but Snover has a 30% encounter rate at that exact same route, and they're literally found at level 38 or 39, meaning all it has to do is gain a level or two to evolve it into an Abomasnow, making it not all that difficult to get. And also, before we begin, I have to announce the winner of my mystery box giveaway, who is none other than Fraz174. Congratulations, Fraz. Please DM me on Instagram or TikTok so we can sort out shipping details. Also, guys, this selection was completely randomized, and a big thank you to all who entered. If you want to see another giveaway, then drop a big like on this video and we'll get rolling on another one very soon. Alright then, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. From the Kanto region, the hardest Pokemon to capture is none other than Chansey. Hopefully, this one doesn't come as that big of a surprise, as Chansey's elusiveness is pretty well known. I mean, it is right there in the name, Chansey. And in every single iteration of the Kanto games, it is far and away the hardest Pokemon to find in the entire region too. In a normal playthrough, Chansey can only be found in the Safari Zone, but while in the Safari Zone, it only has a 1% encounter rate. So this of course means it's gonna take a ton of running around and encounters to even have the chance of finding one. But just finding Chansey is only half the challenge. Once you do finally run into one, Chansey only has a catch rate of 30, and if you didn't know, catch rates are based on a scale of 1 to 255, with 1 meaning a Pokemon is basically impossible to capture, and with 255 making a capture almost a certainty. So that means Chansey's 30 catch rate equates out to just under 9%. But don't forget, things work a lot differently here in the Safari Zone. And you of course can't actually damage Chansey at all either. It also has a flee rate of a whopping 45%, which is among the highest in the entire Safari Zone. Now in the Gen 1 games, you can kind of cheese the Safari Zone mechanics thanks to a minor glitch. However, it was cleaned up and then removed in Fire Red and Leaf Green. At the very least, you can get access to Chansey in a much easier way in Red, Blue, and Yellow, as well as in the Let's Go games. This is because you can find one through a normal encounter, as they are found within Cerulean Cave, but it is locked into the post-game. So in all, between its 1% encounter rate, 8.8% catch rate, and its 45% flee rate, and you add in all the kinkiness of the Safari Zone mechanics, it all just equals out to one headache of a time for a Pokemon that really isn't all that good. In the Johto region, it gets a little funky. In Gold and Silver, 3 different species of Pokemon have a 1% encounter rate, those being Snubbull, Dunsparce, and once again, Chansey. However, both Snubbull and Dunsparce's encounter rate can skyrocket up to 40% during each of their own respective swarms. And meanwhile in the remakes, Dunsparce becomes much more accessible, while Snubbull can still only be found in one route at a 1% encounter rate. But in both Gen 2 and Gen 4, Chansey will always only ever have a 1% encounter rate, so it is consistently the hardest Pokemon to find. However, that doesn't mean it's the hardest Pokemon to capture in Johto. Instead, that honor goes to the legendary beasts. Now obviously, that infuriating roaming mechanic is a major factor in this, but there's actually a lot more to it. If you don't know how the mechanic works, every time you enter a new route or town, the beasts randomly scatter throughout the whole region, which makes them nearly impossible to track. The entire process is very frustrating, especially if you aren't necessarily looking for them on a playthrough. First of all, they'll oftentimes just appear randomly, so you more than likely won't always be ready to take on these beasts. Second, if they do outspeed you, then you won't even get the chance to attack, as they'll just instantly flee. And third, all of the legendary beasts have a catch rate of 3. Just 3. Which is ridiculous, and so that means it comes in at an abysmal 1.6%. The most logical way to capture them is to use a mon like Haunter, and then get it to use a move like Mean Look, which will prevent them from fleeing. But even with that, these legendaries will still be very tough to battle against. Here in Hoenn, we of course have to first discuss Feebas. If you're a longtime Pokemon fan, I'm sure you already know just how difficult it is to find one of these. In the entirety of the massive river on Route 119, Feebas can only be found while fishing in 6 total tiles. And even within these 6 tiles, Feebas still isn't a definite encounter, as it only has an encounter rate of 50%. So there is a good chance that someone could skip over one of these 6 tiles if you're only doing 1 encounter per tile before moving on to the next. And also, these 6 tiles will change every single day. So that means all your progress throughout the river could be lost if this process takes you too long. However, I'd argue that obtaining the Regis are almost just as difficult and also just as time consuming, if not more. I mean, you literally have to know how to read Braille to understand the proper steps necessary. And sure, now, thanks to the internet and walkthroughs, this whole procedure has kind of become mainstream and much more accessible. But in the heyday of Generation 3, the internet just wasn't as prominent as it is now, so that meant all we could really do was just use a guide. Or, well, learn Braille. And that's not even to mention that the process itself is also very difficult and also quite time consuming. Finding both a Relicanth and a Wailord is actually really tough. And finally, all of these Regis also have a catch rate of just 3, which does tie it for the lowest in the entire Pokedex. And that means, just like the legendary beasts, you'll only have a 1.6% chance of catching one of these legendary titans. So in both the originals and in the Hoenn remakes, both Feebas and the Regis can be absolutely brutal to capture. And it mostly comes down to some random RNG and also a crazy amount of luck. From the Sinnoh region, there are a few very difficult mons to obtain. The first Pokemon I have to mention is Spiritomb, as you need to have an odd keystone and then talk to at least 32 people while underground. Now this mechanic was never even spelled out for us in the games, so without a guide, you probably never had any real idea of how to even obtain a Spiritomb. Then, there's also Mesprit and Cresselia, who are both worth mentioning as they both use that pesky roaming mechanic. And the final honorable mention goes to Regigigas, as you need to obtain all 3 Regis from the Hoenn games, then you have to transfer them over via Pal Park to finally encounter the leader of the Titans. However, these all pair in comparison to who is far and away the hardest Pokemon to capture in Sinnoh, who is none other than Munchlax. Like a couple other mons on this list, Munchlax only has an encounter rate of 1%. But what's extra difficult about Munchlax is that he can only be found within honey trees. Now the mechanics of these honey trees can be very time consuming, as you of course have to slather honey onto the honey trees, then wait a real-time 6 hours to encounter a Pokemon. And you also can't cheese this mechanic either. Changing your DS clock won't affect it. And you also can't reset your game in hopes that another Pokemon will appear, as the Pokemon itself is determined the second you slather the honey onto the tree. But there's also so much more to this selection. With these honey trees in Sinnoh, there's always a 10% chance that no Pokemon will appear at all. So that basically just means you wasted 6 whole hours for nothing. Also, if you don't check on these honey trees within 24 hours, then the Pokemon itself will just disappear from the tree entirely. Finally, there's a grand total of 21 honey trees all throughout Sinnoh, but a Munchlax can only be found in 4 of them. And those 4 trees aren't predetermined, as they are randomized in every single copy of each Sinnoh game. So to recap, Munchlax can only be found in 4 of the 21 honey trees at a 1% encounter rate. And these honey trees do take at least 6 hours per slather to activate. And that's all of course assuming that this wasn't one of the 1 in 10 times where no Pokemon shows up at all. And this without a doubt makes Munchlax the most difficult Pokemon to capture so far in this video. They did at least make Munchlax a whole lot easier to find in BDSP, but still, that's not enough to save it from this spot. In the Unova region, there are 4 Pokemon that only have a 1% encounter rate across both sets of games. However, that's not the lowest encounter rate in this region. That's because in Black 2 and White 2, hidden grottos got introduced into the games and were scattered throughout the Unova region. Inside these grottos, you could find a multitude of rare and powerful Pokemon that will also likely have their hidden abilities. There's only ever a 20% chance that it's actually a Pokemon inside the grotto, with another 40% chance of it just being an item, and then the final 40% being just absolutely nothing. Okay, but now's where we find out who the hardest Pokemon to find in Unova is, and that being both Pinsir and Heracross. Now these 2 bugs can only be found in the hidden grotto within Lostlorn Forest. In Black 2, Pinsir has a 0.25% chance to spawn, which is the lowest spawner encounter rate in the entire series. Meanwhile, Heracross has a 0.75% chance to spawn. But then of course these encounter rates are inversed in White 2. So that means there's a below 1% chance of these mons spawning within that 20% chance of the grotto even having a Pokemon inside it at all. What this all means is that whenever you enter the hidden grotto in Lostlorn Forest, there's a 0.0015% chance that there's a Heracross in Black 2 or a Pinsir in White 2. But this also means that there's a 0.0005% chance that you find a Heracross in White 2 or a Pinsir in Black 2. Well, no, I didn't run the math like this on every entry in this video. This is definitely the lowest percentage based on pure numbers and RNG. From Kalos, it's actually the white form of Flabébé, and there's not really a whole lot to this one. While Flabébé does have 5 different forms, their encounter rates vary vastly, and all of the forms can only be found on Route 7 in all of X and Y. The white form can be found in the normal grass, as well as in both the yellow and purple flowers. However, in all of these locations, it'll only ever have a 1% encounter rate, which does in fact give it the lowest in the entire X and Y games. But regardless of that, it still makes it one of the simplest to capture in this entire video. From Alola, I'm sure you've probably heard of the 1% Salamence SOS call in Sun and Moon. However, Bagon is actually quite easy to find in these games, especially in the Ultra versions. So that ultimately disqualifies it from this spot. Instead, the hardest Pokemon to capture in Alola is Mareanie. In both sets of the Sun and Moon games, Mareanie can only be found within an SOS battle, and they can only be summoned by a Corsola. And finding Corsola itself can actually be very tricky, as it can only be found while fishing in just 2 routes in all of Alola. And that's not to mention that its encounter rate is also relatively low too. Then, once you do finally find one, you then have to force Corsola to activate the SOS mechanic. And when it does call for another Pokemon, 80% of the time, it'll just be another Corsola, which makes a Mareanie SOS counter the other 20%. But then, once you do finally get one to appear, it actually isn't all that tough to capture, as it does have a catch rate of a pretty easy 190. In all honesty, this one really isn't all that difficult to capture, especially because you can kind of cheese the SOS mechanic with the Adrenaline Orbs and also False Swipe. It all really is just a matter of finding Corsola and then being a little bit patient. The hardest Pokemon to capture in Galar are of course the Galarian birds. I mean, besides having to pay extra real-world money to obtain these birds, they all also utilize the ever so frustrating roaming mechanic. But here, the roaming works a bit different, as each respective bird can be found in the wild areas throughout Galar and the DLCs. Once you do find them, all three have these gimmick type of mini games you must first complete before getting to battle them. For Articuno, you essentially have to play a game of follow the ball in the cup, and if you fail, you're forced to fly back down the mountain and restart the entire process. Then for Zapdos, you pretty much have to chase it down throughout the entire wild area. And finally for Moltres, you pretty much have to cut off its flight pattern throughout the Isle of Armor. And while just encountering these birds is one thing, capturing them is definitely another story. Because, guess what their catch rate is? Yup, it's 3. The battle for Articuno is especially tricky as it will be hailing, so that means it could very well faint from the weather, seeing as it isn't actually an ice-type Pokemon. Meanwhile, all these birds are also all level 70, so they could possibly do some major damage to your team as you're just chucking your balls at it. For the rest of Galar, there's really no other Pokemon quite as difficult as these 3 to capture. The only other Pokemon that kind of comes close is Dreepy, as it only has a 2% chance to appear in the wild area well under the correct weather. As for the Hisui region, it should come as no surprise that it's Enamorous. While the catching aspect of the game got a whole lot easier in Legends Arceus, the same just doesn't hold true with respect to Enamorous. To capture one, you first have to complete the main story of PLA. You then have to complete Request 94, which alone can be very time consuming and also quite tedious, as you do have to capture all 3 forces of nature, which is a frustratingly massive task on its own. Then, once you do capture them, you also have to max out all 3 of their research levels all the way up to level 10. Then the real challenge begins, as you have to track down and try and capture Enamorous. Once you do finally track it down, get ready to get frustrated as Enamorous will continuously look to flee. Anytime you get close to it, it will always stun you, then fly halfway across the map. To get the chance to even battle her, you slowly have to sneak up on it without ever getting noticed. Then, you have to launch mud balls, stealth spray, smoke bombs, jet balls, or whatever else to actually break its shield. And to top it all off, once you do finally get an opening to try and capture it, of course its catch rate is the ever so common 3, which again means it's basically a 1% chance. And unless you can actually trigger a battle with it, you're gonna have to keep repeating and repeating the same cycle with Enamorous. Meanwhile, this whole time you also have to evade the other wild Pokemon, which includes the Alphas. This can quickly become super frustrating and also very time consuming. It took me well over an hour and a half, with 3 different restarts and about 4 different YouTube walkthroughs before I could finally capture it. But I also have to give a special mention to the titular character of the game, Arceus itself. As to capture one, you literally have to capture every single mon in Hisui, while also collecting all the plates and then finally beating Arceus itself. As I'm sure you already know, Scarlet and Violet introduced some drawn out and frustrating evolution methods. However, that isn't today's topic, and that's a video for another day. Instead, we're only looking at the hardest Pokemon to capture from each region. And so here in Paldea, we have both Roaring Moon and Iron Valiant. Neither are actually obtainable in the main story, and they're both locked behind the post-game. But once the credits have rolled, they can both be found in Area 0. However, they are both very well hidden. I mean, without some YouTube walkthroughs, I wouldn't have ever found this spot on my own. But once you do go deep into this cave, both of these Pokemon are very rare finds in the overworld as they only have a spawn rate of just 5%. But if you kinda just run around and battle some Pokemon, they will eventually pop in. But then, once the battle begins, both of these Paradox Mons can actually be quite tough to face, as they will likely be just as highly leveled as your team. And when it comes to trying to capture them, they both also only have a catch rate of 10, which is the second lowest of any non-legendary Pokemon in series history. But in all honesty, these two aren't that hard to find, especially when compared to some others on this video. If anything, they're just kind of well hidden. The thing is that there just really isn't any Pokemon from Paldea that is outwardly difficult to catch. The only other Mons worth mentioning here in Paldea are Ditto and Zorua. This is because they can only be found while imposternating another Pokemon in the overworld. But other than that, yeah, there's no Mons that are really that hard to capture in Gen 9. Well guys, that's that. Those are all of the hardest Pokemon to capture in each respective region. Be sure to let me know if you've successfully captured any of these Mons, and also tell me how long it took you to do so. Also, check out these other videos on screen now for lots more awesome Pokemon content. Thanks guys.